Hello everybody, welcome to the e-learning center University of Hyderabad's MOOCs lessons on the environmental humanities. We have had a preliminary survey of what ecocriticism means. Let's refresh ourselves about what it implies. Ecocriticism is the analytical and critical interpretation of texts through the prism of environmental ethics, through the prism of environmental policies, the study of serious and catastrophic environmental changes. It is an application of this to the analysis of literary and cultural texts to decode what these texts have by way of their environmental imagination. As we continue our exploration of ecocriticism, let's approach the ecocritical analytical mode through a set of ideas and concepts which we have already explored in the preliminary lectures. Our first concept here is anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the man-centric or human-centric view of the world. It assumes that the human is the center of the world. It automatically therefore leads to differentiation and a hierarchization of species, because it's assumed that man being the center automatically rules over the other species. For the environmental humanities, this set of assumptions enables a certain kind of criticism, which says that humanity survives only with the cooperation, mutual interspecies cooperation of living and even non-living forms. Therefore, anthropocentrism is not a valid position or worldview simply because for humanity to survive, to live, it requires a cooperation of everything from climate and weather to other bacterial and other living life forms. Humanity in terms of its practices, however, has disregarded this cooperation, this mutual dependency. In fact, what it has done is through its practices from agriculture to industrialization, science and technology, population and urbanization has severely and perhaps irreversibly damaged the environment. In other words, we are looking at a situation where the very presence of humanity on earth from the time it first appears to now has resulted in irreversible changes, perhaps damage to the environment. Paul Crusoe therefore argued that we also can perhaps date the geological time of earth to the time from when human intervention becomes palpable and tangible in terms of what it does to nature. The term he coins is the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is geological time based on human intervention and human active damage to the world's resources, to the world's climate, to topography, landscape, what have you. Anthropocentrism and Anthropocene are embodied in several literary texts across the ages. Let's turn for as an example to anthropocentrism in the English Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Up there on your screen is an excerpt from his well-known and multi-anthologized text, Tintin Abbey. If you read the text very carefully, what you notice is there is of course nature, there is landscape, there is the presence of other organisms such as plants, but all of this are made available to us through the poet's consciousness or the speaker's consciousness. In fact, when you look at the poem's excerpt up there very carefully, what is centered is not nature but the seeing human eye, the seeing and perceiving human presence. This is an instantiation of Wordsworth's anthropocentrism, where the famous poem here documents nature, but nature as subservient to, as observed by human consciousness. The poem here, like in his other autobiographical narrative, The Prelude, is not really therefore about nature as much as it is about the human's presence and perception of nature. We have several other instances that you can perhaps look at. For environmental humanities, this becomes a problem because these so-called great, within quotes, works of art and literature endorse, validate, indeed reinforce the anthropocentric view. The texts such as Wordsworth's poem that we looked at implicitly and explicitly state that it's human consciousness that shapes the world, that determines what the world is like. This becomes a problem because for people like Wordsworth, the nature and its forms, landscape and its forms exists only insofar as to entertain my consciousness, my perception. In all these texts, therefore, what you see is there is a sense that humanity, the human speaker, is at the center. However, this would be a rather one-sided reading of Wordsworth, I admit. It's possible to see within the same poem Wordsworth modifying his anthropocentric position slightly. Look at the second excerpt up there for you alongside Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, emotion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. This is again Wordsworth continuing in Tintern Abbey. Now, if you pay attention to this particular excerpt, what is Wordsworth's speaker doing? He is, of course, claiming a unity with nature, with the living and non-living forms, waterfalls, the sky, the river, trees, and things like that. But the speaker attributes a sense of self, of being who he is, to this location of the person, the being, the human person, within a particular context. As he puts it, all of this in the mind of man, emotion and a spirit that impels all thinking things. It rolls through all things. The thinking is impelled by the world. The mind, which is the seat of rationality, of human thinking, and on which, of course, humanity prides itself, is itself the product of the world around. Wordsworth, therefore, what he is saying is the supremacy and so-called superiority of the human is challenged. He is asking us, are we really supreme when all our thoughts, when all our thinking, when all our so-called rational abilities proceed from nature itself? Look at the other excerpt up there from Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. What is he saying there? I morphed into a portion of that around me. I mean, that's a summary, a paraphrase of what's up there. What Byron's speaker is saying is that I am not independent of the world. I'm not independent of the world around me in terms of the nature, natural settings, landscape, rocks, climate, what have you. In both these excerpts up there, you see the anthropocentrism and the anthropocentric worldview significantly shifting, because the speakers are saying we are a part of nature. And you will recall the other excerpts we have looked at in preceding sessions of Gary Snyder and other things, other literary cultural texts. In these two texts, the human as a center of the universe is being challenged. If you remember what I began with today, the anthropocentric worldview results in the production of differentiation and hierarchization of species, of life forms. This leads to what increasingly is being called speciesism. Speciesism is like racism or patriarchy, the differentiation of species, but a hierarchization of species where some species are made or believed to be or constructed as subordinate to the human. Non-human life forms and non-living components of nature are all deemed to be lesser or inferior. In literary representations, therefore, most animal forms, insignificant ones like bacteria on to other larger forms, are constantly imaged as ugly, threatening, hostile to humanity. Why? The minute we think in terms of speciesist argument, these are species that are unimportant. If they are unimportant, their demise or their execution is of not much consequence. Establishing dominion over other living forms and other non-living forms is what constitutes humanity as supreme. In other words, this whole idea that the human is above everybody else is possible because we have positioned some species below us. It is not that these other species are on par with us, because we are doing the classifying, and when humanity does the classifying, it automatically situates these other species at a lower level. The minute you situate these other species at a lower level, it is possible for us to say they can be exterminated because they are not of as much value as we are. Take a look at this slightly longer excerpt from the cult English novel, which sets in motion a whole train of novels in similar fashion, but also inaugurates a particular style of English prose. This is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and the 18th century text about a castaway. Look at what Crusoe is saying here. If you read the excerpt, he is referring to a whole group of animals that he has found on that particular island and over whom he has established dominion status. He is saying, to those I gave some freedom. I allowed them to sit at the table here with me. I gave them food, but I made sure that they are not troubling me. They depend upon me, I understand that, and so on and so forth. So this is extended description. It's not the only place where this description occurs. What does Crusoe do in this passage? It's an excellent example of speciesism, where he's suggesting that This group of people, non-living forms, people in one sense, because the word Defoe's Crusoe uses is actually subjects. So one traditionally assumes that subjects are human persons subject to the sovereignty of a king. What Defoe's Crusoe does is precisely that. He calls them his subjects. So non-living forms, land, trees and all that aside, Crusoe has to establish sovereignty over other life forms that are non-human. And what he is doing is, he is saying, I sit at the head of the table and they are all sitting around me. His sovereignty and authority on this particular island, on which he is a castaway, depends on his establishing this authority. So please recall what I said. Anthropocentrism and speciesism, that mostly go together, imply and suggest that humanity is the crown of creation, that we are superior and supreme, as a method of dominating over, of controlling other life forms. These hierarchies therefore are not as simple as we think they are. These hierarchies are responsible for the extermination of species, for their control by humanity itself. As we look at another example, you will see this emerging far more clearly. 100 years after Crusoe's novel comes Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, arguably the first and most sustained examination of man playing God in a science fiction text. This is what Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, says about himself and about his project, about creating life. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. Here Victor Frankenstein is saying, I will create life forms and those life forms will be mine, as in they will be my subjects, they will be my creations. He is not just therefore only a creator, he is Lord and Master, he is ruler, he is sovereign entity under whom these others function. Take these two examples together, your case studies on screen, Daniel Defoe's Crusoe and Frankenstein from Mary Shelley. In both cases, the human is establishing or attempting to establish authority solely by means of dominating over, controlling other life forms. Think of what we have said. Anthropocentrism says we are the center of the world. Yes, but proceeding from this is the assumption that because we are the center of the world, the rest of the world is subservient to us. When we say the rest of the world is subservient to us, we automatically imply that other life forms are our subject races. So let's recap by way of a conclusion what we have studied today. Ecocriticism's emphasis on looking at the concepts such as the Anthropocene or Anthropocentrism and Speciesism draws attention to the fact that humanity establishes its superiority, its sovereign status, only through the domination of other life forms. This implies that the presumed construction of humanity as supreme hinges upon exploitation, instrumentalization, and very often the extermination of other life forms. If the environmental humanities draws our attention to this, we also therefore have the first moments of an environmental ethics.